Good evening, everyone, and Hag Smech, and it's delightful to be with you all this evening. So Shavuot falls on the 50th day, following 7 weeks of counting from the second day of Pesach. That's why the festival is called Shavuot, meaning weeks. When the temple stood in Jerusalem, Shavuot was Yom HaBikurim, the day of first fruits, and also known as Chag HaKatzir, the feast of the harvest, the day when our ancestors would bring the fruits of the early summer harvest as offerings to the priests. After the last temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, the first rabbis transformed the festival into Siman Matan Toratenu, the season of the giving of our Torah. They did this by connecting the 7 weeks of counting 7 weeks of the counting to the Torah narrative, as we read at the beginning of Exodus chapter 19. On the 3rd month of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt, on that very day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai. Having journeyed from Rephidim, they came into the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in the wilderness. Israel encamped opposite the mountain. The Jewish year begins with Nisan in the spring, Aviv being the biblical name, the month in which Pesach commences on the 15th day at the full moon. Counting 7 weeks from the second day of Pesach, Shavuot falls on the 6th day of the 3rd month, later called Sivan. So not an exact correspondence, but given that the Sinai narrative explicitly mentions 3 days before Revelation, the correspondence is close enough. Let's just pause for a moment to consider the significance of the location of Revelation. The ex-slaves, both the Israelites and the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude that made a dash for freedom with them, encountered the Eternal One in the wilderness, in the empty desert. It was there between Egypt and the land that the narrative in the book of Exodus locates the establishment of the covenant with the Eternal. Let's just pause for a moment to reflect on that. The Torah portion read on Shavuot morning is the account of the happenings at Mount Sinai, with at its heart, Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances became known in the Christian reception of the text as the 10 Commandments. Unlike at any other time of the year, the congregation stands for the Torah reading in commemoration of the ex-slaves standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. When we speak of revelation, we tend to focus on the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai as the expression of revelation. In my contribution to this Tikkun Leil Shavuot, we're going to focus on the setting, on the visual audio drama that surrounded the delivery. I'm doing this because when we read Exodus chapters 19 and 20, we're confronted with an astonishing triangle of messaging. 2 sides of the triangle are taken up with a description that suggests both the presence of the Eternal on the one hand and the utter elusiveness of the Eternal on the other. The 3rd side of the triangle is Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, presented with absolute clarity and comprehensibility. The triangle encompasses the sense that God was there at Mount Sinai, and we know what God said through Moses, and that simultaneously the Eternal was and remains an incomprehensible mystery. My concern this evening is not with a text critical approach to the accounts of the revelation in the Torah. That is, with identifying the sources of the material and the links between Aseret HaDibrot and similar codes in Near Eastern societies at the time, like that of the Babylonian king Hammurabi. The issue for us this evening is not whether or not Aseret HaDibrot were actually delivered in the wilderness of Sinai 7 weeks after the slaves escaped Egypt. Rather, I'm inviting us to consider that we've inherited a text that, albeit crafted together from a variety of sources, addresses us as an integrated whole, and as such, challenges us to reflect on the paradoxical revelation that defined our origins as a people, the mystery of the Eternal on the one hand, and the clarity of the divine utterances on the other. And it's not just the Sinai narrative that confronts us with this paradox. From the very beginning of the Exodus story, the reader is presented with an earlier version of the triangle. Most of us will be familiar with the story about God speaking to Moses out of the burning bush that was not consumed by the flames. And this is related in Exodus chapter 3. On the one hand, the message of the Eternal is clearly articulated. Moses must return to Egypt and tell the slaves that the God of their ancestors is going to deliver them from slavery. On the other hand, apart from the magical quality of the burning bush that was not consumed by the flames, two other features of the text convey a very different and utterly ungraspable message. The passage opens at the beginning of Exodus chapter 3 with these words. Now Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Yitro, priest of Midian, and he drove the flock behind the wilderness, Achar Hamidbar, and came to the mountain of God towards Horeb. Achar Hamidbar, behind or after the wilderness. Some translations ignore the preposition achar. The Plaut Chumash just says into the wilderness. The Hertz, by contrast, does translate achar, but without bringing out the behind or after inference. So we read to the furthest end of the wilderness. But if we're reading the text for nuance and what it says about the context of the extraordinary the extraordinary encounter between Moses and the Eternal, then the word achar suggests not simply a wilderness location, but a location beyond the wilderness in another dimension. So we have two sides of the triangle, the Eternal's explicit, clear message to Moses on the one side, and the mysterious location on the second side. And then there is a third side, the startling declaration about the nature of the Eternal at the heart of this narrative. We read, Moses said to God, behold, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, Eher, Asher, Eher, adding, thus shall you say to the Israelites, Eher has sent me to you. I've not translated Eher, Asher, Eher. The translation is extraordinary enough. I am that I am, or I shall be what I shall be. The Hebrew Imperfect expresses continuous present into future, but the Hebrew is much more extraordinary. Just listen to it again. Eher, Asher, Eher. Eher is barely consonantal. It is the nearest one can get to the articulation of breath. The Hebrew text is conveying a powerful message. The Eternal is too elusive to capture in language or in any other means available to us. This crucial message was preserved by the early rabbis in the way they treated the four consonants, Yud He, Vav He, that are present in the Hebrew Bible as the name of God. An ancient form of the verb to be, the consonants Yud He, Vav He, must not be pronounced. In order to ensure that they are not pronounced, a substitute word is used instead, Adonai. The vowels attached to Yud He Vav He in the Masoretic text finalized by the 10th century as the authorized text to be transmitted from generation to generation are from the Hebrew word Adonai, which means literally, my lords. So even before the narrative takes us to Mount Sinai, we are alerted to the essential elusiveness and ungraspable nature of the Eternal. Let's now take a look at the texts that describe this audio-visual drama of Revelation. And we're beginning at Exodus chapter 19, verse 16 through to the end of the chapter. My own papers in order. I'm not so good at reading on the screen, so I'm probably going to read my papers. Okay, so we're looking at verse 16, and I'm just going to read first of all from verse 16 to the end of chapter 19. This is Exodus 19, and this text immediately precedes Exodus 20, which begins with the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances. On the actually, it is clear enough for me to read. Thank you, Leah, for making it so large. On the third day, as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning and a dense cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud blast of the horn. And all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their places at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for the Eternal had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him in thunder. And the Eternal came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain. And the Eternal One called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. The Eternal One said to Moses, "Go down, warn the people not to break through to the Eternal to gaze, lest many of them perish. The priests also who come near the Eternal must stay pure, lest the Eternal break out against them." But Moses said to the Eternal, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, 'Set bounds about the mountain and sanctify it.'" So the Eternal said to him, "Go down and come back together with Aaron, but let not the priests or the people break through to come up to the Eternal, lest God break out against them." And Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. And that last verse, Moses went down to the people and spoke to them, is what immediately precedes Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances. So we're going to focus on verses 16 to 19, just to look at this language. So, Vayhi vayom hashlishi, and it came to pass on the third day, biyot haboker, at the breaking of the dawn. Vayhi kolot v'rakim v'anan kaved al hahar. And there was thunder and lightning and a heavy cloud upon the mountain, and the voice of the shofar getting very strong. And the people trembled who were in the camp. And Moses brought out the people to meet God, min hamachaneh, from the camp. And they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now let's just look at some of this language. We've got kolot. Now it's interesting, the translation thunder, the literal word here is kol, is a singular, which we know is voice, and kolot, voices. So Hebrew's got a very small vocabulary. So this kolot, voices, is the voice of the weather, the voice of the thunder. Uvarakim, and then we've got the lightning, and we've got the heavy cloud. So we've got a real sonne lumiere going on the mountain. And I don't know if any of you have seen the Charlton Heston MGM, the 10 Commandments, but they do it quite well in that film. And of course, the voice of the shofar getting stronger and stronger. So what the people are experiencing is a fantastic sound and light show that is very, very overwhelming, that so much so that it makes them tremble. And then we read at verse 18, Har Sinai ashan kulo mipnei asher yarad alav Adonai. And the mountain of Sinai was all in smoke because the Eternal One had come down on it ba'esh, in fire. So we have fire and smoke, and the smoke of it was like the smoke of a furnace. I mean, the translation says kiln, but I think furnace is a more powerful word. And the mountain trembled very much, or exceedingly. And what's interesting about this is we have a kind of reciprocity here. We've got the people trembling in the camp, and we've got the mountain trembling. It's the same word. So we've got a very kind of all-encompassing experience, the sort of thing when you go to those special cinemas where they have everything's around you. This is a very all-encompassing experience. It's being done with natural phenomena apart from the shofar. And then we've got this very interesting verse, which this section concludes. Vayehi kol hashofar cholech v'hazak ma'od. And the voice of the shofar was going on and getting stronger and stronger. Moshe yidaber, Moses spoke. Ha'elohim ya'enenu v'kol. And God answered him in a voice. And that's a very interesting way round, that Moses spoke, and this is the response of God in a voice. And what we mean by this voice is this thunder, the kol, is the sound that we are receiving from this amazing experience, as well as all the visual signs. So what is this language doing? This language is conjuring up a scene which is extremely awesome. We use the word awesome much too often. I think we use the word awesome for all sorts of things, but this really is genuinely what the word is for, this awesome experience. But why is it necessary? Because it's trying to say something about the presence of God, that we know God is here because all of this is going on. And yet, of course, God isn't here. We've got thunder, we've got mountain, we've got smoke, we've got fire, we've got a voice of a shofar, but we haven't got God. And then, of course, we've got, as you understand, throughout the Torah, get direct speech from God to Moses, which, like the 10 utterances, is a complete contrast to this. But the overall impression is of this presence and yet the mystery, a complete mystery. Now, it's interesting that directly after Aseret HaDibrot, we return to this. So if we look at the second sheet, and this actually is going to find now is the second sheet.
Sorry, 1 second.
No worry. So Aseret HaDibrot is Exodus chapter 20 verses 1 to 14, and immediately afterwards we have this text, a short text at the top. All the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. You speak to us, they said to Moses, and we will obey, but let not God speak to us, lest we die. Moses answered the people, be not afraid, for God has come only in order to test you, and in order that the fear of God may be ever with you, so you do not go astray. So the people remained at a distance, while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. So again, we've got the thunder, we've got the lightning, we've got the smoke, all those in a shorter text, all those elements. And it's interesting, sometimes translations do sort of slightly bewilder me. Where it says they fell back, this Yanu is actually that they tottered, they shook, the people were tottering and shaking. So we had Veyecherad in the first, they trembled, and here we've got them tottering and shaking. That's what this overwhelming experience of that they're apprehending with their eyes and their ears is doing to them. What they're not doing is actually physically, obviously, seeing God or hearing God speak. Moses is the one doing the delivery. Now, if we continue, and just checking the time, see how much I've got, another 5 minutes for this. We've then got the conclusion of the narrative of Revelation is at the end of the next parashah, which is Mishpatim, which is the first coherent kind of code of laws in the Torah. And then right at the end of it, chapter 24, we return to the scene. And this scene is one where Moses is accompanied by Aaron and Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's sons, and 70 elders of Israel. We're just going to go a little bit further down the text and look at, where are we going to look? We're going to look at verse 9. Now this is a covenant moment. So the actual covenant is done by in a sacrificial way with blood, and Moses reading the book. And so a covenant moment happens. But I just want us to focus on verse 9. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 elders of God ascended. So they're going up the mountain. And they saw the God of Israel, under whose feet was the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. Yet God did not raise a hand against the leaders of the Israelites. They beheld God and they ate and drank. Now, it's interesting that there's a juxtaposition in the account of Revelation between what happens to the people who are down there at the foot of the mountain, Moses usually going up the mountain, and then the role of the priests, of Aaron and his sons, and the elders who somehow have an opportunity to sort of get nearer to God. But what's interesting when they say they saw the God of Israel, we don't actually have a description here of the God of Israel. It refers to God's feet, which reminds us of when Moses asked to see God in the parasha Tikvah-Sarah, Exodus 34, and the response is, "You'll see my back, but my face will not be seen." So here we have reference to God's feet, and the feet being kama'aseh livnat hasapir, like the work of a pavement of sapphire, u'cha'etzem hashamayim latoha, and like the very essence of the heavens for purity. Now, it's very interesting if you think about it, that we have an image here of a pavement, of something below that the feet are on, and of heavens, something above. But what's between the below and the above is obviously not seen. So this is another way that the text tries to conjure up something about the elusiveness, the ungraspableness. We're told that they saw God, but actually the description we have is not one of them seeing God at all. And then, and unfortunately, I didn't have space, and I've decided not to use a third sheet for the way it concludes, because I'm going to read it to you. This chapter concludes after then. The Eternal One said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, and I'll give you the stone tablets with the teachings and commandments which I've inscribed to instruct them." So Moses and his attendant Joshua rose, and Moses ascended the mountain of God. To the elders he had said, "Wait for us until we return to you. You have Aaron and Hur with you. Let anyone who has a legal matter approach them." So this is the context of them having a leadership role. And this is the crucial bit. Vayal Moshe el hahar, and Moses went up the mountain. Vayichas he'anan et hahar, and the cloud covered the mountain. Vayishkon kavod Adonai al har Sinai, and the glory. Now it's interesting, the translation says presence, but it's literally the glory of the Eternal One dwelt on Mount Sinai. Yichasehu he'anan, and the cloud covered it, the mountain, sheshet yamin, for 6 days. Vayikra el Moshe bayom hashvi'i, and God called to Moses on the 7th day, mitoch he'anan, from the midst of the cloud. Umar'ei kavod Adonai ka'esh ochelet b'rosh hahar, and the appearance of the glory of the Eternal was like fire consuming the top of the mountain. And this was in the eyes of the children, b'nei Yisrael. So what the people see is a fire consuming the top of the mountain. Vayavo Moshe b'toch he'anan, and Moses went in the midst of the cloud. And vaya'al el hahar, and he went up to the mountain. Vayhi Moshe bahar arba'im yom v'arba'im laila, and Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So we have a presentation that is both very visual, very audible, but at the same time very mysterious. And I'd like to conclude by saying that the word revelation that we use all the time is actually very misleading. If you look up the definition of revelation, it assumes the revealing of something previously unknown, so it's now known. As we discover when we read the revelation narratives in the book of Exodus, the eternal cannot be revealed, but only experienced, and then translated into words, into meaning that is comprehensible to us. Hence the thunder and lightning, smoke and fire, and the blaring voice of the shofar. I want to conclude with another narrative found in the first book of Kings, chapter 19. It concerns the prophet Elijah and relates that, thoroughly dismayed by the people's betrayal of the covenant and the only prophet left alive, Elijah fled into the wilderness and went on a journey of 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the mountain has two names, Horeb in the burning bush story, Horeb here, and Sinai in the Exodus narrative, where he lodged in a cave. The story goes on to say that the word of the Eternal came to him and asked him what he was doing there. And after relating Elijah's reply, the text gives the divine response. Then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Eternal." And behold, the Eternal passed by. And a great and strong wind broke into pieces the mountains and shattered the rocks before the Eternal. But the Eternal was not in the wind. Then after the wind, an earthquake. But the Eternal was not in the earthquake. Then after the earthquake, a fire. But the Eternal was not in the fire. Then after the fire, kol dama daka, a thin whisper of a voice. And it was that when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Kol dama daka, a thin whisper of a voice. The more usual translation is a still small voice. Like ehir asher ehir, the words kol dama daka, although much more consonantal, attempt to express the unexpressible. The Eternal is ungraspable, but the message is clear and can be transferred to the narrative of the Sonne Lumiere at Mount Sinai. The Eternal is not in thunder and lightning, in wind and earthquake and fire, or in the blaring voice of the shofar. The Eternal is utterly ineffable. And so finally, we are left with the words we conjure to acknowledge that the Eternal is ultimately beyond us. Ehir asher ehir, kol dama daka. And yet, despite the limitations of human language, we have the power to translate the Eternal into words and make God speak. And so between the visual audio drama that we find in Exodus 19 and Exodus 20 verses 15 to 18 that convey the elusiveness of the Eternal, we have Aseret Hadibrot, the 10 utterances of God set out in Exodus 20 verses 1 to 14. All of it and more elsewhere in the Torah, demonstrating the efforts of those who went before us to transmit revelation. Thank you.